Are you sick and tired of having your favorite fantasy shows cancelled after just 1 or 2 seasons? Are you sick and tired of watching studios butcher their current fantasy adaptations, pouring millions of dollars into them and wondering where that money is actually going? And in the meantime, chasing away their main actor and disrespecting their audience's intelligence time and time again? Well, you might also be sick and tired of hearing the question that every single fantasy show faces in the early stages of its release, and that is, will this be the next Game of Thrones? I was inspired to make this video based on 2 of my recent experiences. The first was during the creation of my previous video about Shadow and Bone, and seeing how many times the media could use the phrase the next Game of Thrones in their article. And second being the recent uproar surrounding Avatar: The Last Airbender and Netflix's live-action adaptation. In an interview with IGN, showrunner Albert Kim said that he had to make the new show appeal to people who were big fans of Game of Thrones. And I was very interested by this wording, because he said that he wanted to keep it as close as he could to the original, but he had to make it a serialized Netflix drama, walking the line between the humor and action scenes of the show versus the dark and mature scenes. People then began freaking out and assuming that Netflix didn't understand what made Avatar good in the first place, that they can juggle these mature themes while also being goofy at the same time. Coupled with the fact that Game of Thrones is infamous for crashing and burning, so people were like, do you really want to make that comparison? But let's be honest here, the showrunner was not saying that he wanted to replicate a Game of Thrones-like story with gore and sex and violence everywhere. The executive producer and director clarified that, because they are trying to make a show for the most viewers possible. They have to find a way to fit it into this 8-episode driving narrative that keeps us streaming. And I believe that those words are a direct reflection of Netflix's intentions with this series. They want that kind of viewership, they want that kind of popularity, success on a global scale. We want to be a cultural phenomenon just like Game of Thrones was. In other words, there is a very high expectation for fantasy shows, and that bar is set so high by studios because of Game of Thrones and the impact that its success had on the fantasy genre. Now, everyone watching this video will have a completely different expectation of fantasy adaptations. Some won't watch them at all for fear of having their characters ruined for them. Some absolutely love seeing the characters that they love on screen. So I just wanted to share my personal expectations of adaptations. I try to go into them with an open mind. I expect change, and I try to stop myself from the way of thinking this didn't happen in the books to questioning why they're making those changes in the first place. But I still expect the 2 narratives to have a similar vibe, to keep an overarching theme, to ensure that the magic of the original is still there. But most of all, I expect an adaptation to stand on its own as something good and something of quality. But my mindset for going into fantasy adaptations has changed in the last few years. Nowadays, I have this very cynical apprehension. I have this inherent distrust of studios, and that is amplified when their new fantasy show starts inevitably being compared to the one and only Game of Thrones. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm not here to sit and argue about the actual quality of these shows, because it seems like the studios don't really care about that either. I'm also not here to argue that Game of Thrones was the greatest show to ever exist, or that it was even a good adaptation from the original source material. And I'm aware of the absolute disaster that was season 8. I'm aware that there was so much backlash, but that still doesn't change the fact that when this came out, everyone and their mother was watching this show. And I'm also not interested in talking about its legacy in pop culture nowadays or its rewatchability. That's a different conversation, a completely different video. What I am interested in, what I do want to argue, is that the obsession with finding the next Game of Thrones is hurting the fantasy genre. Because in my opinion, it feels like fantasy shows are no longer being made with a fantasy-loving audience in mind. So before we even begin to break down that question, we need to understand why Game of Thrones was so successful in the first place. It was the fantasy show that took over the world and dominated the last decade. Millions of people were watching this show, and the viewership grew by the millions with every season. And a lot of the viewership statistics that I can find online are limited to the US, which means it doesn't even count the global audience and the pirating audience. It is widely regarded as one of the greatest shows of all time, being the second most decorated show at the Emmys with 59 wins altogether, while also being known as one of the greatest failures and fall-offs of all time. It was well known for its graphic depiction of violence, sex, it had these shocking plot twists and betrayals, it was epic in scope with a character for almost everyone. It was referenced in multiple other shows that were the biggest of the decades. People were calling their kids Khaleesi. Game of Thrones was inescapable. It was just massive. It made fantasy accessible to the average non-reader, namely by turning the fantasy elements down and being a very political story within a fantasy setting. A lot of people like the show, a lot of people dislike it, and whether they were readers of the original series or not, that doesn't change the fact that this show was one of the biggest parts of pop culture when it was coming out. And alongside these reasons, Thrones, the global environment and landscape that Game of Thrones was released in set it up for success. The release of Game of Thrones was lined up so well with the rise in digital culture. Both social media and streaming were gaining momentum alongside the show's release. HBO used Game of Thrones to popularize their platform Go, and then launched season 5 alongside HBO Now as sort of like a gateway series, similar in a way that House of Cards did for Netflix. But it also came before the streaming services were saturating the market with more and more series, dividing the attention of audiences and competing with other platforms in a way that HBO never had to do with Game of Thrones. The week-by-week episode releases and the year-by-year season releases were a perfect schedule because it allowed the fanbase to consistently build and talk and speculate and plan watch parties. And the only time I've experienced that with a fantasy show is House of the Dragon, where social media platforms are a prime place for conversation and speculation. It actually transcended the label of just being another TV show. Game of Thrones was an event. Things like episode names and descriptions were analysed and discussed. And there's a world behind the show. There is so much for fans to delve into. And of course, we've seen it time and time again, something that is so popular in pop culture will eventually be replicated. Or at least they'll try to. Harry Potter, Twilight, and The Hunger Games are all examples of film adaptations that have turned their genre or subgenre mainstream and resulted in an explosion of media trying to ride the wave of popularity. Nobody ever replicated the success of the films I just listed, even their original creators. And that's part of the reason why I believe it's just such a ridiculous expectation to believe that this Game of Thrones success is achievable when history just tells us time and time again that it isn't. Now, I'm not saying that there will never ever be a show that captures a global audience in the way that Game of Thrones did. Shows like Stranger Things and Squid Game prove me completely wrong. And this situation is different from the situation with Hunger Games, because the books that these new fantasy shows are based off aren't copycats. They are their own book that most of the time came out way before the Game of Thrones show, and they're popular for their own unique individual reasons. For these new fantasy shows, the issue comes in the process of adaptation, and in the influence that Game of Thrones has had on the art of transforming these series into something that is suitable for the screen. There's a reason that these still feel like copycats, and it's not a fault of the show. While most of them are very different from Game of Thrones, they were likely selected for adaptation because of their general advantages and similarities. A long fantasy book series with a huge cast of characters that began publishing before the 2000s, and therefore has had the chance to garner a multi-generational fanbase. But in the marketing of these adaptations, instead of celebrating the differences and the originality of these new TV shows, the media are obsessed with filling a void. They call it the Game of Thrones void, and we don't need this to be filled. But I also can't fully blame the media for this. I just don't think that studios are putting in the effort that is needed to show that fantasy can be more than just Game of Thrones clones. You can't expect Game of Thrones success when you don't put in Game of Thrones level efforts. And it's not like they're not spending money on this. There have been billions of dollars put into achieving this feat of the next Game of Thrones. We know that Jeff Bezos allegedly ordered his own Game of Thrones for Amazon with a formulaic checklist for pitching new shows. So Netflix's Avatar told us what that question really means. But Henry Cavill in this interview says it so perfectly.
And for me, I've always thought of it, ever since I've been hearing about the Game of Thrones comparisons, it's like saying this actor is going to be the next Tom Cruise. There is no next Tom Cruise, there's only Tom Cruise, and Tom Cruise exists as the incredible performer and producer that he is, in the same way that Game of Thrones will exist all by itself, and that's it. The Witcher might be the next successful fantasy series, but time will tell.
I've touched on 3 groups that sort of form this discussion. The media, who are desperately trying to find the next Game of Thrones. The studios, who want to replicate and reap the success of Game of Thrones. And they're always looming in the background behind the showrunners and producers who just want to make a show, but are constantly stalked by the questions and their subsequent pressure regardless. During my research, I was really interested in what the showrunners added to the conversation and how they felt about their show being compared to Game of Thrones. So I've compiled a few, and for this video, I'm focusing on shows that were listed in the Daily Mojo's Next Game of Thrones video. The responses were pretty varied. The showrunner of Dark Materials was grateful for Game of Thrones. Rather than being daunted by the shadow that Game of Thrones left, Tranter was confident that his Dark Materials was distinctly and uniquely its own piece. The showrunner of The Wheel of Time saw Game of Thrones as a burden. He was adamant in letting Amazon know that if they were looking for the next Game of Thrones, then this wasn't it. He said that there was no pressure from Amazon and that they'd heard more about Game of Thrones in the last few days than in the entire 2 years of production. He also believed that the next Game of Thrones isn't necessarily a fantasy show, and the next thing that will pop the cultural bubble and exist in that huge global space will be something totally different. The author of The Sandman, Neil Gaiman, was inspired by Game of Thrones and the way that they adapted their story and put it on the screen. The Rings of Power showrunners avoided Game of Thrones comparisons wherever they could because they wanted to make a show for everyone, including kids, so that it wouldn't include the levels of violence and sex that Game of Thrones is known for. But the one I was most interested in was The Witcher, because A, they were probably the most infected by the Game of Thrones questions because the start of their show came out right when Game of Thrones ended back in 2019. And B, Lauren Hissrich, the showrunner, provided a great counter-argument for my contention for this video. She believed that the cultural dominance of Game of Thrones helps a new fantasy series coming onto the scene. She said that Game of Thrones showed the world that fantasy wasn't just for a niche audience and it could be acceptable for everyone. And I absolutely agree with her that Game of Thrones paved the way and probably helped a lot of these series be greenlit because it increased the demand for new fantasy stories. And I completely agree that when people ask, will this be the next Game of Thrones, they're actually asking, could this be as successful or renowned as Game of Thrones? And that point about chasing the success of Game of Thrones mirrors what I said at the beginning, regarding how that ongoing success and growth is what everyone on the project strives for, because why wouldn't you reach for the stars? Simple. If you miss and you fall, it's death by cancellation. Netflix has cancelled countless fantasy shows in the last few years. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. You have the strikes, the budget's not justifying the profits, the ratings might struggle and the reviews might be less than favourable. But the reason we're focusing on is the big budget, high fantasy expectations being genuinely unattainable. As I mentioned previously, in the research that I did for my Shadow and Bone video that partly inspired this video, I found countless articles that talked about how Shadow and Bone was going to be the next Game of Thrones. And I said that I thought one of the reasons it was cancelled because it simply didn't bring in a Game of Thrones level audience. After 2 seasons, they just didn't see enough growth and enough interest to keep the project running, despite the 200,000 strong fanbase who are petitioning for a revival of the show. And to me, this example perfectly represents what I'm trying to say with this video. Netflix are essentially saying that the fanbase is not enough. Your devotion to this series and to this story and to this cast is just not enough for us. And for me, the explanation is that Netflix just doesn't want to take risks. I'm not saying that Shadow and Bone was going to ever be the next Game of Thrones, right? But what I will say is there was clear untapped potential in the Six of Crows spin-off, but that would be such a huge risk to cancel their main series but keep the spin-off even though it was already written with a script, so they axed it. And the reason I bring up risk is because Game of Thrones was a massive gamble for HBO. Martin literally warned them against it because he was just scared that it was going to be too big. And I think this is what studios fail to recognize with fantasy, is that success takes risks. You have to give these fantasy shows a moment to breathe, a moment to cook, if you will. High fantasy will not get the overnight success that shows like Stranger Things or Squid Game has gotten, because as Game of Thrones proved, you need multiple seasons to set everything up and build and develop your strong fan base. And if you're wondering if this is turning into another video where I just attack Netflix for the whole time, you're basically right. Netflix rely on instant virality over traditional marketing, which already puts high fantasy at a complete disadvantage. And you can see that here where they have real faith in Stranger Things as a show to go viral. But when you apply that same logic to something like Shadow and Bone, it just doesn't feel like enough. And he says here that they had real faith in Stranger Things, and fair enough, it was a really good first season. So I don't understand why Netflix won't put more faith in new high fantasy shows. I'm gonna circle back to The Witcher now because it's such a fantastic outlier for this video, and it actually might be the only fantasy show that Netflix is applying this logic to. So Hissrich almost turned down writing for The Witcher because she was so scared of it being compared to Game of Thrones. She said the Witcher fanbase deserves someone that knows they can write a fantastic fantasy show. Someone who has experience writing fantasy, someone who can give them what they're expecting, and she didn't think she was the person to take that on. And with how The Witcher has turned out, I am starting to think that Netflix are putting their faith in the wrong people. My experience with The Witcher is pretty limited. I watched the first few episodes of the first seasons and I liked it enough, but I never really felt the need to continue, so I cannot speak on the quality of later seasons. But I did go down several rabbit holes while I was researching this video, and the absolute shitstorm that is The Witcher is baffling to me, and it is definitely not encouraging me to go back and start watching the show again. Netflix is very intent on creating the world of The Witcher. There is 3 seasons and a spin-off out, along with an animated movie, I believe. The spin-off is called Blood Origin, and it casted massive actors like Michelle Yeoh. But it didn't fare well with audiences or critics. It was only 4 episodes long, which makes it a bit difficult to create any kind of suspense or connection to characters. And look, if it's Game of Thrones success that they were looking for with that, comparing that spin-off to something like House of the Dragon is pretty embarrassing. And despite this series going downhill in ratings and in viewership, there is still a 4th season planned and another spin-off planned. And this is literally just me speculating, but I think that The Witcher being bad actually kind of works for the Netflix model, because bad doesn't necessarily mean cancelled if it's still getting people to watch it. If people are still tuning in to see what kind of trash you're putting out to make fun of it, and it kind of reminds me of Riverdale in that sense, because that was a shit show and it went for 7 seasons. And I think this is where things begin to break down with a lot of fantasy shows. It comes down to a lack of respect for audiences. And a lot of creators don't seem to understand that that was the fundamental part of Game of Thrones' success. And I'm talking about the first few seasons here. You weren't treated like an idiot. If you missed something, you had to go rewatch every single conversation because every moment felt valuable and important. And there are plenty of similarities between The Witcher's downfall and season 8 of Game of Thrones. Whether it's bad writing or a straight up ignorant treatment of fans, The Witcher managed to piss off fans so much that the main actor left the show. And then they went one step further, and the producer said that they needed to simplify the show for the masses because Americans wouldn't understand a complex story. They thought that a higher level of nuance to their show wouldn't reach people. And the same individual said that when it comes to shows, the younger the public is, the logic of the plot is less significant. And apparently the only significant thing was pure emotions, because these people grew up on TikTok and YouTube and they have such short attention spans. Like, are you kidding? I don't think I can come up with a better way than that to make people stop watching your show. It just feels like an excuse. I don't know how much they changed from the Witcher books to the actual adaptation, but that's just embarrassing. The popularity of Game of Thrones shows that people love and appreciate complexity, but the rant is starting here because the media can't decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, Game of Thrones has a huge fan base, and according to this article, it trained a generation in a way that is not good for future showrunners. The generation of smart, engaged audience members that expect more from their television entertainment are hungry for something new. And now any TV creator trying to court this desirable fan demographic in a post-Thrones world will have to take into account the fact that their target audience is primed to overthink any plot twist a showrunner can throw at them. And it's hard enough to write a television show that doesn't have thousands of fans tearing through its script to find a nugget of viable prediction. Watch out, the fans who generate conversation and word of mouth about your show that in turn makes it more money are coming for you with high standards and an expectation that your show just isn't shit. And that also plays into my next point, which is there's a general lack of respect for fans of the source material. The creators of the original Avatar: The Last Airbender left the Netflix show because of creative differences. And in an open letter to fans, they said that Netflix said it was committed to honouring our vision for this retelling and to supporting us on creating the series. Unfortunately, things didn't go as they had hoped, so clearly Netflix didn't honour them. And after watching some fantasy show reviews of The Wheel of Time and The Watch, it felt like people had to put aside their love for the source material and treat this show like it was something new. If you are alienating the one community who is dedicated to loving your show, I think you're doing something wrong. Neil Gaiman said it himself, the fan base are fans. They like the source material because it's the source material they like. And if you do something else, you risk alienating them on a monumental scale. It's not Batman if he's now a news reporter in a yellow trench coat with a pet bat. I think that sometimes these shows try to make themselves for everyone and they end up making them for no one. It feels kind of exploitative when you are trying to make a fantasy show for everyone, but the reason that you were able to make this fantasy show in the first place is because the original fan base made it popular. And I'm not saying that these creators shouldn't try to make these shows appeal to a wider audience, but they should at least show a little more respect to the fans who are the reason that they're making the show in the first place, because they made the series popular enough for a studio to pick them up. Now, I'm going to return to the idea that the comparison to Game of Thrones is a good thing. Number one, it's a great marketing technique. It's smart, it gets people's attention, and it's a pretty common marketing practice to say, hey, this is for fans of blank and blank, and if you like this, you'll love our show. You're directly targeting a certain audience demographic who likes similar things. And I think we, as audiences, are inherently nostalgic and constantly looking for that feeling that we got when we last read something or watched something that we loved. Even Game of Thrones was pitched as The Sopranos in Middle-earth. And obviously that was to the studio, not to fans, but it still shows that comparison is literally everywhere and nothing is ever fully original. But this is where the media comes into play. I think the way that they use Game of Thrones to hype up every new fantasy series needs to change. The wording around it needs to change. The whole reason I started one of my new favorite series, Shogun, on Disney Plus was because one of my favorite content creators compared the writing and the politics to the first few seasons of Game of Thrones. And I think that was the specific wording. This show is not trying to be the next Game of Thrones in any way. It's its own individual piece of media. It stands by itself as brilliant. Also, in this day and age, I just feel like no one is falling for that. The average viewer can sit down and watch 2 minutes of Shadow and Bone or Rings of Power and figure out that it's nothing like Game of Thrones. And you can't argue that that at least pulls them into the show and gives them the opportunity to stay or go. But as we've said time and time again, as soon as they make that comparison, they risk alienating their entire fan base just like they did with Avatar. My conclusion is that fantasy readers deserve better. I think a lot of the time, studios or even producers just don't expect us to have standards. They don't listen to our concerns. They don't appreciate feedback. But we are allowed to dislike something if it is bad and it looks like there has been zero effort into respecting the original and creating something meaningful. I sometimes get the vibe online that some people believe that criticism will equal the cancelling of a show. Never accept being told to just enjoy things because they are free to enjoy them and we are free to hate them. And I do think that there are some steps being taken in the right direction. The fact that Avatar was renewed for 2 seasons is good, because it means that they can avoid something like Stranger Things where there is a decade between seasons and the fan base just ends up losing interest and your momentum and your hype is all gone. And I think maybe once the studios and the media accept that there will never be another Game of Thrones, things might start to get better. But I also just don't see this conversation going away anytime soon. I feel like it always pops up in conversations about adaptations because people say, well, this could be better than Game of Thrones. So here's hoping that our favourite fantasy books and series will be picked up and not ruined. And the day that we leave that show in the past will be a great day. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments below.